Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lausanesiris, and this is grecochess, my chess YouTube channel. And we'll continue now with the 79th chessanity chess tournament that took place on June 8th at Jericho, New York. Today we're going to cover round number 3. You remember, if you have seen my previous videos, I started round number 1 with a win, and round number 2 I had a draw. But before we start, let's once again share the announcement of the tournament. This is the announcement of the tournament. There are 4 USCF rated sections, and I'm participating in the only one I'm eligible, the U2000, meaning for players rated under 2000. It consists of 3 rounds, meaning every player has to face 3 opponents. And in each round, the time control is G50, D5, meaning when they start, their clocks are set up at 50 minutes. And when it's their turn to play, for the first 5 seconds, the clock does not move. And after that, it starts going down. And the players need to complete all their moves before the time goes to 0, because if it reaches 0, then they lost a game, no matter how wonderful the position, even if they are one move away from checkmate. There are a few exceptions that they may claim a draw, but usually if your time goes to 0, you have lost the game. Once again, we're going to share with you the photos of the location. This is how the elementary school where the tournament took place looks like from the outside. Now we're going to see the cafeteria from the inside. In this room, the players actually played the games. Of course, this is half of the cafeteria. The other half looks exactly the same, and I played my games in the other half. You see that the boards and the clock have been set up by the organizers, and this is a huge help to the players that don't need to worry about it, especially how to set up the clocks. And this makes the player's job much easier. We only have to focus on the games. And after the first 2 rounds, the leading player is Alen Grigoryan. He has won his first 2 rounds, so he has 2 points. 4 players follow with 1.5 points, and one of them is me. On the third round, I faced Alen Grigoryan himself, which meant that if he won, he would be first, he would be the winner of the tournament. If he drew with me, he would tie for first, but if I won, then I would tie for first. Let's see now at the statistics of the 2 players. These are my numbers. My rating, as you see, is 1554, and my percentile is 85.8. And let's see the numbers for Alen, my opponent. Here are his numbers. Sorry, wrong screen. I need to share once again the correct screen. Alan's number are the following. His regular rating is 1244, and he's in the 74.8 percentile. This means, of course, that I'm the favorite because my rating is much higher than his. But this means very little. The only thing that matters is what happens in the chessboard. And we're going to go through the moves one by one, and you're going to see on the left how the board looks after every move, and on the right, the computer evaluation. A plus sign means computer believes white has the advantage, and a minus sign means computer believes that black has advantage. And also after every player's move, you're going to see if that was the best or not, what could have been the best move, and then what are the best three options for the other player. This is at this part here, which is analysis. I had the black pieces, Alen had the white. And Alen starts with the d pawn, moves from d2 to d4. I reply the symmetric way, pawn from d7 to d5. She continues the c pawn to c4, and this is called the queen's gambit. Why it's called the queen's gambit? Because on the queen's side, you offer a pawn. The gambit may be accepted or declined. By the way, gambit means when you sacrifice a pawn because you believe that by doing so, you enhance your position. I may either accept the gambit, meaning I take the pawn at c4, but then, according to theory, I should not hold on to this pawn. Otherwise, white has a very dangerous attack, pushes the pawn to e4, controls this diagonal, this long diagonal, so on. Well, otherwise, I might decline it. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to move my pawn from e7 to e6. Alen develops his knight to c3, and I develop my other knight to f6. Alen not only develops his bishop at g5, but also pins my knight, and I better deal with it now. Otherwise, I cannot move the knight, and if exchanges start happening in the center, I may end up being at least a pawn behind. And I deal with the pin by moving my bishop to e7. Alen now moves his pawn to e3. And on my side, I castle. We've already completed 5 moves and we are still book move, meaning we're still in theory. This position has been played many, many times and has been analyzed exhaustively. Alen continues, his knight will go, now his other knight will be developed to f3, again a book move. And I reply by moving my pawn from c7 to c5. Why? Because I want to exert pressure on the square of d4. Now it's not book move anymore, but computer thinks it's excellent, although it would rather have me play the pawn from h7 to h6. But the difference, as you see here, is very minimal, so it's not that important. Alen will develop his pieces, his bishop, sending it to d3. And since he already moved his bishop, well, the computer thinks it's not the best move. The computer would rather have him take my c5 pawn. And so from being slightly ahead, he's slightly below now. And since he's already moved his bishop once, I'm going to take the pawn at c4 and force him to move the bishop for a second time if he wants to take back. And that's what he does. Now I'm going to develop my queen, attacking the pawn at b2 and also exerting pressure on the d4 square. Not the best move for the computer, but the difference here are quite small. Now, once again, the advantage is going to go to white, to Alen. Alen is going to protect his b2 pawn by moving his queen to d2. And I'm going to develop my knight from b8 to send it to d7. Alen pushes his pawn from d4 to d5. And I'm going to take the pawn with my I'm going to take now the pawn back with my pawn at e6. Alen will take the pawn with his bishop. And here I really need to be careful. If, for example, I take the bishop, he'll take my knight from f6. I take the bishop. He'll use his c3 knight to take my knight, and then he attacks both my queen and attacks twice my bishop on e7, and I'm at least a piece down. In order to avoid such a scenario, I move my queen to d6. He's going now to move his pawn from e3 to e4. And I'm going to use my knight to take his bishop at d5. He will use his knight to take my knight at d5. And I'm going to take his bishop at g5. and he will finally take my bishop at g5. Now a series of captures has been completed, and let's see how we are. Both sides have a queen, two rooks, 6 pawns. I have a bishop and a knight. Alen has 2 knights. More or less it's equal. The computer thinks that I have a very, very small advantage, 0.01, a hundredth of a pawn. At this point, I felt uncomfortable with the queen at g5 near my king. If he can bring any other piece, of course the queen alone cannot do any damage, but if he can bring any other piece, or if he can start pushing the pawn, h-pawn, and have the rook join the attack, I'll be in danger. And in order to avoid it, I move my pawn from f7 to f6. Now, usually this is a little scary because I open this diagonal here from a2 to g8. But since Alen has no light-colored bishop, I don't have to worry about a bishop taking advantage of this diagonal. Alen will save, of course, his queen, send it to h4. And now my knight from d7 will go to e5. So either we exchange knights, or otherwise my knight can go to f3 and interfere with his king's defense. And yes, he exchanges the knight. I take it back with my queen. In case you wonder why with the queen and not with the pawn, first of all, I give him a chance for a check with the knight, and also this pawn becomes isolated, meaning it will become an e-pawn with no pawns at the neighboring files D and F. And this is considered to be a weakness, at least in most cases. And now with my queen in the center of the board, it's another advantage. It's exactly the center and can go to any of the 3 central squares. But also I'm attacking the pawn at b2. If Alen is not careful, I take it, attack the rook, and I have a huge advantage. Of course, Alen saw it and defended by placing his knight to the square c3. Now time for me to develop my bishop from c8, moving to e6. So all my pieces, at least my light pieces, have left the back rank, and my 2 rooks, they're still in the 8th rank, but at least they can connect with each other. Alen castles. And it's time for me to take care of my rooks that currently they have very little mobility. I would like them to be on the open files, and the open file at this point is a d file. So my rook from f8 goes to d8. Alen challenges the d file by placing his rook on d1. And I want to avoid any tricks with the knight going to b5. Of course, at b5, it doesn't threaten anything, but from there, it eventually could go to very crucial squares and create all kind of threats. Of course, not immediately, but eventually. That's why to stop any such ideas, I move my pawn from a7 to a6. Alen starts now being more aggressive. He moves his pawn from f2 to f4 and attacks my queen. Usually, you may have heard that be very careful when you push your F pawn, because this diagonal here is open. And if you remember from game number 1, I used this open diagonal, first of all, to win a pawn that eventually gave me the game, but also I almost painted my opponent's queen and won the queen. Only the last moment he saw that this was a danger. I save, of course, my queen. I have plenty of options. I send it to c7. Now he moves his rook from d1 to e1. It's an inaccuracy, and I realize it because he surrenders the d file to me. And I move my rook from d8 to d2. Rook on the 7, actually on the 7 for white, on the second rank for black, is very, very strong, attacking all pawns that have not yet moved. And Alen realizes it, so he wants to exchange. He places his rook to f2. And I'm going to exchange the rooks. He takes back with his queen. Now, I'm going to occupy the d file with my other rook. Goes from a8 to d8. He will push his pawn from f4 to f5 to threaten my bishop. My bishop may go to c4, but I prefer to keep it safe and have it send it backwards to f7. His queen goes to e3, and my queen now will go to e5, the center of the board. We've completed to this point 25 moves, and a little by little I start getting a small advantage. You see, I have a 0.91 advantage. It's not, of course, enough to win the game, but better have this advantage than your opponent having it. And Alen is a little bit worried about the a2 pawn because currently the knight at c3 protects it, but his knight is stuck at c3. That's why he moves his pawn from b2 to b3. And I copy him. I move my pawn from b7 to b6, supporting the c5 pawn. He will move his knight to a4 and attack my pawn at b6. And I will defend it by pushing my rook from d8 to d6. His rook goes now to c1, hoping to get some game along the C file. The computer thinks it's a mistake and gives me an advantage of 1.75. Now, this is a serious advantage. I don't like his knight on a4 attacking these two pawns on b6 and c5, even if temporarily they're defended by the rook by the queen. I don't want these heavy pieces, the rook and the queen, to do nothing else than defend some minor pawns. And that is why I move my bishop to e8. And what I would like to do, if I could have it my way, is do the exchange, not only get rid of this knight, but I double his pawns and my c pawn becomes a pass pawn. And of course, Alen will not allow it. He will send his knight back to c3. My bishop now goes to c6, and the whole game now will go around the pawn at e4. If I can win this pawn, especially without losing anything else, I will have quite an advantage. I already have an advantage of 1.73 with equal material, and imagine the advantage if I can win the e4 pawn. So the whole question is how many times I attack it versus how many times it's defended. I'm attacking it with my bishop and my queen 2 times at least, and he defends it with his knight and his queen, winning 2 times also. When you attack a piece or a pawn and you want to get it, you must attack it once more than it's defended, because if I start now the exchanges, not even my turn to play, but even if it was, I take the pawn, he takes my bishop, I take the knight, I lose my queen. But if I had, for example, the rook anywhere that it would get it, then I would end up winning the pawn. He will try to defend the pawn once again with the rook from c1 to d1. So at this point, I attack the pawn 2 times and he defends it 3 times. So I need to attack it twice more. And how? Yes, I could eventually bring the rook behind, but I don't have any other piece. Perhaps the king could come, but then I have to be careful about the king. But let's see what happened. I decided to use the rook to attack the pawn by moving my rook not to on the e file, but on the square d4. You see now that I attack the pawn 3 times, the e4 pawn, with bishop, rook, and queen, and it's defended 3 times with queen, rook, and knight. And we completed 30 moves. The 31st moves, I have an advantage 169 according to the computer. Of course, during the game, we didn't have access to computers. All I knew was that the material was the same. His pawn at e4 was backward, and I could attack it. I didn't know if I could win it or not, but at least I could constrain him because still, if I attack it 3 times and he defends it 3 times, yes, I cannot grab it, but I'm tying his pieces. They must defend this pawn. Well, on my side, anytime I see an opportunity elsewhere, I can move my pieces and go wherever there is the other opportunity. That's the way of thinking. What does Alen do now? First of all, he stops any idea of a background mate by moving his pawn from g2 to g3, and by doing so, he also controls the f4 square, which the computer does not like it and gives me an even larger advantage of 236. What can I do? I don't want to move any of my 3 large pieces, queen, rook, or bishop, because they are attacking e4. What else can I do? I don't want to start moving my king and perhaps endanger it, so I move my pawn from b6 to b5. Let's start advancing the pawns. You never know when that will be crucial. You can see now the possibility. If my pawn goes to b4, the knight has to leave and then I win the pawn. How can he stop it? Perhaps he could move his pawn from b3 to b4, but then I take the pawn. Again, I attack the knight. So it seems that I'm near winning the pawn. All I need to do is one more move and move my pawn from b5 to b4. And Alen, who is playing, tries to stop it by placing his knight at d5. But that's exactly what I wanted. Now I start a series of captures, and when they are over, they will last for 2.5 moves, meaning I'll capture 3 times, he'll capture 2 times, and you'll see what happens now. I take it, he takes his knight, he takes my bishop. Then I take his queen, he takes my queen, and finally I take the pawn. After these moves are completed, after move 34, I finally have an extra pawn. So it's not enough that the computer gives me already 2.13 advantage, but also materially I know on the board I have an extra pawn. It's not a passed pawn yet, so it is not that dangerous yet, but my goal is to do the appropriate exchanges so that it becomes a passed pawn and promotes. Of course, what Alen will try to do is attack my pawns any way he can, and who knows, he might be able, either because of a great position or because I'm careless, to win back a pawn, and then the game is over. What will he do? First of all, he needs to protect the pawn at f5, because if he doesn't, if I grab it, then I'm 2 pawns ahead. This is the last thing he needs. That's why he moves his pawn from g3 to g4. But then I see the opportunity. I check. Why do I check? First of all, you never check just in order to feel proud that you checked. You never check for the sake of check, or hoping beyond hope that it could be a mate with you. Clearly, see, it's not. I check because I'm threatening the pawn at h2 eventually. Alen is going to move his king from g1 to f2. Why to f2 and not to g2? You'll see now, because now I'm going to check at d2 and threatening the pawn at a2. If his king was at g2, or no matter where he would place it, he will lose the pawn at a2. Now at least he has 2 possibilities. Possibility 1 is lose the pawn at a2, and I'm 2 pawns ahead, but the rooks are still in the game. Or he may want, exactly as he did, to place his other rook at e2 and give me the chance to exchange rooks. If we exchange rooks, I'm just 1 pawn ahead, but my advantage becomes even greater because there are no rooks to threaten any potential checks or move around the board and win a pawn here or there. And that is why once he offered the trade of rooks, I accepted it. And now the name of the game is centralizing the king. Centralizing the king so the king can exert high pressure and hopefully win a pawn or help a pawn become a passed pawn and get promoted. Definitely the kings at the end of the board are not helpful at all. That's why for the next few moves, we are both going to move my kings and put them as central as possible. I place my king on f7. His king goes to e4. My king goes from f7 to e7. The pawn at f5 blocks my king. I have to waste the move. I cannot go directly to e6. I still stay on the 7th rank. His king advances and now is really at the center. The square e4, one of the 4 central squares. My king goes to d6. My king is near the center. And now the name of the game is play moves that don't do anything, basically pushing the pawns. What both players try to do is push their pawns, but so long as they are not attacked and cannot be taken. Why? Because White's king is at the square e4, the best square he can dream of. The other 3 squares of the center are blocked. My king is not at the center. I wish it was there, but not far away, and it is the best square, or the nearest one, the center, just 1 square away from the center. So neither of us wants to move the king and push it back. How can we avoid it? Because we need to move. Zugzwang is the German term. When you have to move whether you like it or not, the goal is move your pawns. And he's going to move his pawn from h2 to h4. I think ideally he'd better move it on h3. Computer says the best, but if you want to waste moves, you want to waste as many as possible. So it's one case where it's better to move 1 instead of 2. But it doesn't matter too much. Computer thinks the best. Computer gives me an even larger advantage. As the game goes on, rooks disappeared and kings reach the ideal positions because I've counted that I have more extra moves than him. I'm going now to move my pawn from h7 to h6. Why to h6 and not, for example, move the a or the b pawn? The c, of course, I cannot, it will be lost. Because I'm expecting him to play g5, and I want, once the trades have been completed, not to be left behind, and if possible, be a pawn ahead. Otherwise, with his king so near, I could even be behind, and he may even have a passed pawn out of nowhere. Of course, if I had enough time to calculate all that, I would be less concerned, but we have very little time. And I don't want to take any chances, and I don't want to depend on extreme calculation when I can so easily avoid this possibility. He's now going to push his pawn from h4 to h5, ways to move like that, and not have to deal with what happens if the rank changes. How will I play now? I have a few moves to spare. He doesn't have too many, and now I'm going to make sure he doesn't have any pawn move to spare. My pawn goes from b5 to b4. That's why I moved my b and not my a pawn. What can he do? If he moves any of his pawns, what pawns can he move? Either the g, it's lost, or the a. If he puts it in a3, I take it the regular way. If he puts it on a4, I take it with the en passant. So he must move his king and put it in a square not so nice. It's a little bit further from the center. King goes to e3. My king goes to d5. d5 or e5 eventually doesn't matter. But I put it on d5 because I want to gain the opposition. And some of you that may know opposition, they will say this is a reason to place it on e5 instead of d5. But the reason I do it is because you'll see now what's going to happen. He's going to move his king to d3. And I have a move to spare. My pawn from a6 can go to a5. And now I really have the opposition. What does opposition mean? It means that two things face each other with an odd number of squares between them. And it is my opponent's turn to play. If it was his turn to play, he might be able to block me, meaning if I go to e5, he goes to e3. If I go to d5, he goes to d3. And perhaps he might be able to block me. In simpler cases where there is only one pawn, opposition is very crucial here. I might try to find some way to win, but it would not be so easy. He moves his king to e3, and just to tell you at this point, both of us have played about 6 hours of chess continuously, and we are in this dramatic finale. We are mentally exhausted, but we still need to think of all these tiny details. You mess it up, a small inaccuracy, a small miscalculation, and all your work for all these hours could be lost. Once again, let me repeat, if Alen can get a draw, he is ahead of me in the tournament and he shares first place. On my side, I must win with black. At this point, what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to go back and forth because then it's a draw. If I go to e5, he goes to e3 and it's a draw. What I'm going to do is I'm going to push my c pawn to c4. He will take it, of course. He cannot afford not to take it because otherwise the pawn can easily promote. How will it promote? One way is to go to c3 and have what's called a protected pass. Pawn cannot directly promote because the white king will take it, but the white king will be forced to stay here. Then my king could go, for example, to g4, grab this pawn, grab these two pawns, and I promote from the king side. Another way is to exchange the pawns, and then my a5 goes to a4, he takes, and then my b pawn can promote. It depends on how he replies, but I believe that no matter what he does, I have the advantage. That's what the computer thinks, 6.72. Much more than a rook. Although I have only one extra pawn, the computer thinks I have more than a rook's advantage. What he's going to do, he's going to exchange the pawns. And his king goes to e4. Now Alen develops another plan. He knows I'm going to grab the a pawn and promote my pawns. So what he does is he is hoping for what's called a counterattack, the counter plan on the king's side. If he can get these 3 pawns and push his pawns. But I was calculating as much as possible, and I saw that I needed fewer moves to succeed than he did. The computer lists M18. What does this mean? The computer believes that under best play, I can checkmate in 18 moves at most. Of course, it didn't play the best possible way, but even if you don't play the best possible way, you will win, but not so fast. Move number 47 for black, for me that is, and I push my pawn from b4 to b3. Now, there's no m anymore. Oh, there is an m33. I may or may not have a mate, meaning the computer may or may not be able to see all the way to the mate. But what's happening is that Alen must take my pawn. Otherwise, 2 move promotes, and the king cannot stop it, and his king can neither stop it nor go to the king side and have counterplay with the pawns here. So he takes it, of course, with a check, and I take it with my king. And now Alen starts his counterattack on the king side. But as you'll see, I am faster. We'll go now through the move to the game, and I still, of course, need to be extremely vigilant because the smallest mistake on my side and the result can easily change. And it has happened to me many times in the past. I've lost games I should have won, and of course, to my opponents, I've won games I should have lost. See what's going to happen. My next 4 moves are quite simple because all I have to do is push my a pawn. And also for Alen, it's easy what he needs to do. All he needs to do is push this thing towards my pawns on the F, G, and H files. He wins my pawn at G7. And now I promote to a queen. And move number 52, I have my queen. According to the computer, I need 14 moves to mate, or maybe 12. Even the computer is not sure how many moves are needed to be made, but the computer knows that no matter what my opponent does, I have a mate. Now, Alen cannot take my f pawn because the queen guards it, but can take my h pawn. At this point, I'd better be extremely careful because I lost two out of my three pawns, and Alen has a protected pass pawn. The pawn on h5 is protected protected means it's supported by g4, and passed means that there is nobody to stop it from promoting. And I really need to be careful because one wrong move and everything changes. I'm going to move my queen to g1 because by doing so, the pawn at g4 is lost. No way to be defended. His king cannot go to g5 to defend it because I have the pawn on f6. What will he try to do? He will try to do a stalemate trick that almost worked. Just for one move, it failed. So the trick is the following. What the pawn at f5 cannot move, what you would like to do is after he loses the g-pawn is to make sure that his king is in h8, his pawn at h7, and my queen is on the g file. If he can succeed in that, we have a stalemate and he gets to draw and ties for first place. And as you'll see, he was very near in being successful. His king is moving, I take the pawn, and he doesn't want to lose his pawn, so he moves it to h6. What do I do? First of all, let's get rid of the f pawn with a check. So now all his hopes are on his h pawn. Goes to h8, and my queen goes to g6. He has only one legal move to play. If he didn't have the pawn at a6, if the pawn was at h7, it would be a stalemate, and Alen would miraculously escape the draw. But now he must play this move, and if it was his turn, it would be a stalemate, but it's not. What do I need to do? I better be very careful. First of all, I cannot move my queen to g7 and checkmate because the pawn at f6 goes downwards and he would just grab my pawn and promote his. Even with great players, sometimes they've been blindfolded in the end. Blindfolded, not literally. I'm not talking about blindfold chess, but they've lost concentration in the end. And again, that they did the greatest combinations to reach that ending, finally they lose it because they confuse the pawn which direction it moves. So if I go to g7 with my queen to check, it's the biggest blunder I could ever commit. If my queen goes to f7, it's a stalemate. If it goes to e8, nothing is changed because his king goes to g7, attacks my pawn at f6. But instead, after calculating and recalculating again and again and again, I felt that the safest move I could do is what the computer suggests. Take the pawn at h7. Why? You may think, why should I give away my queen? I tried so hard to promote this a pawn and make it a queen, and I'm giving it away. Yes, because Alen must take my queen, the only legal move, but now my pawn goes to f5. At this point, Alen resigned. He resigned because he knew that his king would always be one rank behind my pawn, and when his king was at the third rank, my pawn would promote, and king and queen versus king is a win. Of course, at this point, I need to thank Alen for the game and congratulate him because he played extremely well. Just a few inaccuracies here and there, some small, tiny errors, and I was lucky to get this e4 pawn, as you remember, and convert it into a win. I conclude the tournament with 2 wins and 1 draw, and I tie for first place. But at this point, what we are going to do is we are going to review the game. We're going to click the button that says review. See what the computer has to say about the performance. It gives me a 91% performance, and it gives Alen 84.7. And if we were to play against the ELO, my Elo, the computer would guess my Elo to be 2450 and Alan's to be 2300. Clearly, these are very flattering because in all three games I had ratings higher than 2000. I wonder how accurate they are, but and let's see now the individual categories. None of us had a brilliant move. I had one great. Best moves, I had 29 versus 21. Excellent, we both had 11. Book moves, Alan played according to the theory for the first 6 moves. I played for the first 5 moves. I had more inaccuracies than Alan, 5 versus 3, but Alan had 4 mistakes, I had none. And I had 1 miss. None of us committed any blunders. And let's go now to the tournament, see the final rankings. I'm going to click here and go to the page that has the results of the 79th chessanity tournament. And let's show the section of under 2000. Here we are. I'm not going to show what the other players did. I'm only going to show my name being on the first place. I tied with the person on the second place. Both of us had 2.5 pawns. We're going to see that I had this miss W. I had the win versus the 5th player. B missed with black pieces. D, I had the draw with the 7th player. I had the white, and W had the win versus the 4th player with the black pieces. And by doing so, my rating for 1555 is expected to reach 1562. These are unofficial ones. And this concludes my recap of the chessanity tournament, the 79th chessanity tournament that took place June 8th, Sunday at Jericho, New York. I'd like to thank, of course, all the participants, my opponents, and most of all the organizers for putting a tremendous effort and making sure that we had our boards and our clocks set up correctly in the beginning. Even the pieces were set up the correct square, so we didn't need to do anything other than play the game. On Friday, I'm participating at the 4th and last round of the tournament at Floral Park. I'm going to cover this game. And for now, I'd like to thank all of you for viewing it, especially to the subscribers. This is Harry Lasaniziris, grecochess. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.